with an organization like this. This is my opportunity to talk about what really is happening in terms of restoring mangroves, and also this is my opportunity to invite everyone to join into exercise like this, both research and restoration. Therefore, I look forward to a discussion that would lead to thinking new ideas and new avenues. So now with that, let me go straight into the presentation, and we can discuss later about what I talk today. So there, as the title very correctly says, that I'm planning to talk about nature-based solutions, not just for conservation, but also with regards to livelihood protection in mangroves. Because at the end of the day, the restoration of mangroves in this country can only be done if we pay real attention and full attention to the livelihoods associated with mangroves. And that's the reason behind this title itself. Most of the participants here today are well versed with mangroves, but if there's anyone that has little idea or would like to polish up the knowledge, I'm just going to take you through some of the real basics that should be known before we start talking about nature-based solutions. So the very front part of my presentation is going to be about the biology of mangrove ecosystems, and also to introduce to the fascinating world of the mangroves, I would say. So with that, let me go to the very first part of the presentation, which will focus mostly on the mangrove ecosystem itself and understanding what kind of an ecosystem it is. So just to let you know that mangroves have been noticed not just now, but also in the past. And as you can see, the very first introductions that were given to mangroves are not very good. As you can see here, muddy, smelly, and buggy areas. From there we've moved a lot, and as you can see, now we are talking about mangroves confined to tropical and subtropical areas. Therefore, something that is unique to us, unique to the tropics and the subtropics, not found elsewhere in the world. And at the same time, when we start talking about mangroves, there's always these words there, and I think it's very important to have a clarity about the words. So we talk about true mangroves and also mangrove associates. So I simply take it in two ways. True mangroves being the species that have correct morphological specializations that enables them to survive exclusively in mangrove environment. So you don't find them anywhere else. They can't survive if the conditions that enables mangroves to stay are removed or taken off. But then also, depending on where mangroves are found, we also have the coastal vegetation intermingling in. So if the mangroves are found in the dry, sort of like dry arid area, you have a certain set of associates. Same way in the wet zone, you might have an entirely different set of species that have sort of like created living conditions with true mangroves. So that's the simplest way of looking at what are true mangroves and mangrove associates. Mangroves, when it comes to true mangroves, there is always the debate how many true mangroves are there. I don't think it's a debate that will ever end, but when you look at the science, you see that around 55 to 72 species have been identified as true mangroves globally. And here in Sri Lanka, despite being a very small country, we boast about 21 true mangrove species. That's roughly 1/3 of the true mangrove diversity in the world. Now, the beauty of mangroves is that they have the capability of forming both mono or pure stands and complex ecosystems. Now, these monostands are very unique because normally in tropical forests, it's very rarely that we see monostands or pure stands. Therefore, it's one very unique character that you tend to see in mangroves. So here you can see how Avicennia marina has created a pure stand of Avicennia marina in Calauea. So that's something quite unique. But then the other spectrum of it is the mixed stands. Mixed stands, if they are allowed to grow without any disturbance, can mimic any tropical rainforest. And what you see here is such an area again, coming from Calauea. And at a glance, though the trees look similar, the species that I've indicated here, the true mangrove species from Rasbora mucronata to Bruguera, Cereops tager to Exocaria agaloca, all of them are present in this particular mixed stand. Now, when we talk about mangroves, we are talking about a very transient zone. Most of the mangroves are found in areas where the rivers meet the sea. So the river mouths are prime locations for mangroves to proliferate. So you are talking about an ecosystem which is very unstable, sediment loads coming with the water, high tidal fluctuations, high tide and the low tide. So there's diurnal variations and also monthly variations with as per the spring tides and the neap tides. And then of course there's the floods and the droughts coming in from time to time. But what is very important is this being these species, the true mangroves, being able to colonize the seafront, have also adopted to survive. And one of the challenges in surviving in that kind of environment is the salt. So most adaptations that you see are in order to manage salt. So I've just given you two examples here. One is Avicennia marina, which is known as Heenmanda in Sinhala. So you can see the salt excreted in the leaf. So that's one adaptation. No matter how much salt is there, these plants regulate salts by excreting them through their leaves. And on the other side of the spectrum is storing of the salts that are absorbed by the tree. So here you have Telecheria or Exocheria agaloca. You can see the red color from yellowish to orangish to the red color leaves that you see in these plants. It tells you a story. The story is that the leaves have stored the excess salt. So when every time when a leaf is falling off to the ground, the tree is getting rid of the salt. So that's a beautiful adaptation if you want to be a survivor in this kind of environments. And then of course, when you have sediments and when you have water, standing erect is always a problem. Now, in order to make sure that these plants stand erect, mostly the true mangrove species have come up with an array of adaptations, morphological variations, as you can see. So one is to stand erect, but then there is another problem. When the soil is covered with water all the time, the amount of air in the soil is very low, and the roots have a real problem of getting oxygen for respiration and also for other physiological sort of life demands. So then in that case, what has happened is that unlike in any other species, you have the roots that tend to come up again. So, betraying the gravity, they tend to come up again. And what you see here is such an example. The knee roots, you can see how they have come up. This is basically to ensure that roots are supplied with sufficient amount of air. But in addition to that, from pneumatophores to the prop and the stilt roots, the knee roots and the ribbon roots that you see here, all these kinds of roots enable the species to survive in soft mud. Especially the prop roots and stilt roots you see here in Rhizophora is mostly seen if that particular mangrove species is adapted to be in the fringe of water. So Rhizophora is one such species that is always loving fringes of riverbanks, so that they have especially the roots that are coming from the branches as well as the stem in order to sort of survive. So that's another very special character that you see in this ecosystem the moment you enter. Well, just like or any other sort of like type of flowering plant assemblage, here itself we have both a display of colors and a game of nectar provision for the pollinators, and of course the use of fragrance to ensure that the plants are pollinated. And when it comes to that, we do have plants, the flowers that are coming early in the morning so that they are fragrant, and late in the afternoon again fragrant. And also we have species like here in Nipa fruticans um, that have male flowers and the female flowers in the same tree, but blooming at different times. So flowering season is in fact a very interesting time in any mangrove ecosystem, because they give a grand display of species, and this is also one reason why mangroves create mangrove ecosystem itself, enabling many species to come and survive here, especially nectar loving species like bees and wasps and other pollinators. So that itself is an important factor, because wherever we have mangroves, that they create natural areas for the pollinators to survive. And that, in fact, is very important for home gardens and others. Right, so now from there, let's move to the next slide. So flowers in time give rise to fruits. Fruits have a new problem. The new problem is, how do you disperse in an environment as unstable and as unpredictable as sort of mangrove ecosystems. Now, different plants have come up with different adaptations here. So what you see from one side is the species that tend to produce fruits that would stay in the plant itself, germinate, and when only the hypocotyl is ready, it'll fall. And these special adaptations, as you can see in that hypocotyl, enables the sort of already germinated sapling to go straight into the mud. It will pierce through the mud, and then it will stabilize and grow into a new tree. From the other side, you can see here the Nipa fruticans over here, which requires or which prefers its seeds to be dispersed to somewhere nearby, to a nearby area, so that they are buoyant, so that they float and then go and settle somewhere else. So these are the kind of adaptations that you tend to see in terms of fruits, in order to ensure that they are dispersed both through air as well as through mud, and they are also very noteworthy. So when you have such plants, There is no wonder that these ecosystems can attract an array of fauna. So when it comes to fauna, you can see from the footprints here, from the largest mammal in the country, the elephant, to the tiniest animal, you tend to see them. And one might wonder what on earth elephants are doing in mangrove ecosystems. Well, they tend to enter mangrove ecosystems periodically, and I've seen it happening, especially during dry seasons, and when the nearby vegetation is dry, elephants tend to depend on the vegetation within mangroves. And also, I suspect that the other reason why they enter to these mangrove ecosystems is to ensure that they get the required minerals, so they act as salt licks for elephants. So then from there, from the elephants, we can talk about mangrove fauna for a long time, but just to give you an idea from the elephants, then we can talk about the importance of mangrove ecosystems for migratory species, especially the birds. So the picture over here, you can see how the brown-headed gulls, gray-crested terns, and the Caspian terns tend to have congregated. This is just before the end of the migratory season. So mangroves are the very first landscape that they encounter when they enter to Sri Lanka after a long migration. And that is also the landscape they tend to use to congregate before they leave the country. So they are very, very important for these species because this is the last place for them to sort of like feed and to be ready to take the long journey back home. So that from there, you can also see a picture that we've taken in Mana, just to give an idea about the role played by mangrove plants. This is Pemphis acidula plant, is Pemphis acidula. And the butterfly that you see here is a very rare kind of a butterfly. And the reason why these kind of butterflies tend to survive in arid conditions that you see in Mana are basically because of the presence of mangrove plants and their associates. So, and then I would also say mangroves are home to a unique assemblage of gastropods. We have Dr. Malik here, I think, we are joined with us. I'm not the expert to talk about them. He'll be able to tell you more about the role that is played by gastropods in these ecosystems, but also at the same time the role or the sort of like associations between these species. Now, I selected this particular photo for a special reason because this comes from a restored site, and you can see how just one single tree that is coming up have been selected by these gastropods in order to survive from the harsh sunlight and also to ensure that they are not desiccated. So these relationships are quite important, and in terms, the fecal matter that they release are the most important nutrient for these plants to grow. So there are very important relationships. And the presence of these organisms, starting from gastropods and also the unique fish assemblages that we see in sort of brackish water, they all tend to play a role between the plants and the animals. So when we talk about mangroves, we also need to remember that the distribution of mangroves in the country are not uniform. There are site affinities and certain species are not found everywhere. Now I've shown here I've shown the audience 3 species to give you a taste of what I've been just talking about. So Lumnicera Vittoria, in Sinhala we call it Ratamilla. Now we find this only confined to Maduganga, again in Maduganga, to a few locations, and That's the only location in the country that we find Lumicera Victoria, and also this is one plant, being despite many efforts to sort of like come up with saplings, we are failing, and it's very interesting to see how we can propagate this plant. We have real problems with Lumicera Victoria. And then in the middle, you see Cereops decandra. Now, Cereops tagal is a species that we tend to see everywhere, but Cereops decandra is a unique true mangrove species that is found in Trinco, Kenya area only. It's exclusive to that area. And the third species that I'm showing here, Scyphiphora hydrophyllaceae, or known as Kalukadol, is found in basically in Mioya to Kalaoya basin in that area. So again, they are showing some important site affinities. Therefore, one thing that we need to remember is that although we find mangroves dispersed all around the coastal line of Sri Lanka, not that the species composition is unique. And even within one location, the species composition can be quite different. And now, in order to highlight the point that I just made, I'm going to share with you some site-specific data that comes from Kalaoya Basin. Now, for those of you who are not sort of like used to Kalaoya Basin, I'm just giving you some facts and figures about the basin itself. This is the basin. As you can see here, it's one of the largest rivers in the country. And when you look at Kalaoya River Basin, the mangroves in this area are very unique and important, and it's important for the community that lives here because they've been fishing. It's a fishing village. Gangewadi is a fishing village, and they've been living here, depending on the fishery in this area. They although now they tend to go into sea, to start with, their main income was coming from the estuary itself. Now, why I wanted to show you this thing, because to us, when we look at it from an aerial point of view, it looks like, okay, mangroves, very similar. But when we did the study, as you can see, we found 14 true mangrove species, and two of them were vulnerable. And we found 32 mangrove associates, and 3 of them near threatened. But the point that I wanted to highlight is not this. The point that I wanted to highlight is this. So when we did the sampling for every location, we looked at the species composition. And here you see a data that we've taken from this particular location in one of the river segments in Upuaru. And you can see what are the species, as well as you can see what actually dominates. So here we have Acrostichum aureum, and then Bryospora micronata, and also Exocheria agloca as the dominant species in this area. Now, the next one, as you can see, it's just the other side. Sorry. Just the other side, you can see how the species composition changes. So that's the very interesting thing that I wanted to show you, because even within one ecosystem, even within one area, depending on the type of salinity and also the influence of the fresh water, plus the tidal fluctuations, to what distance the impact of the high tide is felt, you will be finding different species compositions. Therefore, something that we need to very keep in our mind is that these ecosystems that are not, these habitats are not similar. Even in the same area, we tend to have differences. And that is something that we need to keep in our mind, both in restoration as well as in development. And also, critically threatened species like hydrophyllaceae, Scyphiphora hydrophyllaceae are not equally distributed in here. So they are found only in certain unique places under unique environmental conditions. So that's something I wanted to show you. And here, to further strengthen what I've been talking, you can see all the sites that we've sort of like sampled here. And when you look at the Shannon-Wiener Index of Species Diversity, you can see how the diversity, species richness changes. So this is a good example to sort of like let you know that in working with mangroves, we need to understand this underlying science and also the affinities of the species to the physiochemical conditions of water and the soil in order to meaningfully restore them and also to meaningfully manage them. So now let me go back to where we started. I think this slide is not that important, but I just wanted to tell you that that kind of speech, site-specific information is sometimes important, because unless we have real data for each and every site that is important for us to manage, we cannot think of meaningful restoration. And also they form the baseline for future monitoring of the ecosystem. So later on, when I start talking about restoration, you would understand that why I wanted to share this data with you. So right from there, now I'm going to go into the second part of my presentation. Before we start talking about nature-based solutions, we also need to know why we had to revert back to nature-based solutions. That's basically because over the years, we've not been very kind to mangroves, and that mangroves are suffering from multiple threats. So this map itself is an example for you to understand that we are not talking about a large extent. About 20-25 years ago, yes, we had a large extent of mangroves, but with the expansion of saltons and the shrimp farms, we are now somewhere between 12,000 to 9,000, and the exact amount is yet to be ascertained, and which is now ongoing. So from land conversions, here what you are seeing is this salt marsh, salton, salt pond that has been that was abandoned about 15 years ago, but you can see once such an area is converted, even after 15 years, that there's hardly any new plant coming in apart from few occasional salt tolerant salt marsh plants that comes with rain. Otherwise it's very much like a desert. And then all of you know about how the sort of like expansion of shrimp farming actually destroyed most of our mangroves. But it's not just that, pollution plays a key role. I ask all of you to be mindful in areas like this. This is in Gangewadiya. You can see what happens in a camping site. Here in down south, you can see how one Pradeshia Sabha has selected a river bank. And you can see how the mangroves are suffering in here to dispose their garbage. This is in Deruvalam. And then in addition to that, multiple activities from here, but this is an occasion where I found that this is actually smelting of batteries illegally within Puthalama Lagoon. And then, of course, the pollution, land-based pollutants entering into mangrove ecosystems, resulting in algal blooms. We analyzed the algal blooms in this area, and we found the most dominant species was Limbia. And of course, those of you who are aware about Limbia, you know it's a it excretes toxicants and that can irritate skin as well as the eyes. So pollution, land-based pollution is a big problem to the survival of mangroves. And yes, no matter how much we try to make people aware about the importance of mangroves, they are felled and they are under the axe of many developments on a daily basis. And the development. So this is a reminder for you to be mindful when you go to state of flight, when you go on your next visit, when you make sure that you look at the location and find out whether this scenic hotel that you select, has it been constructed legally or illegally. This is an illegal construction that happened in one of the mangrove sites. Okay. Invasives are becoming a big problem, and you can see here 2 species actually. This is in Hondu area, Mycenia azulina, and then Dillenia subfruticosa in the bottom. Now, Mycenia and Dillenia subfruticosa in particular are really big problems to the mangroves in wet zones. So that's something that we have to always remember. But then the threats are multiple. You know the recent threats that we all had to deal with. We have very few extensive mangrove stands, undisturbed mangrove stands, but then there's always eyes over them, not for conservation, but to convert them into other developments. So I don't want to explain about it. You all know about it. But then what is important is to see whether these muddy buggy ecosystems are important. Yes, of course they are important. I don't want to delve into more details about why they are important. You know it very well. But I'll just state one fact which will make you understand why we need to invest more in mangroves. So carbon. Carbon is one very important component that can be used to give a value to mangrove ecosystems. So here you can see when we compare mangroves with the rest of the ecosystems in the world or are in tropical countries, you can see mangroves and seagrasses play a really important role along with salt marshes in carbon fixation. So you can see the carbon burial rates are really high in these 3 ecosystems. So time has come for us to pay more attention to the that is the seagrasses, salt marshes, and mangroves. It's a high time that we look into these ecosystems and think what we can do further. Right, so having gone through the taxonomy as well as biology, and also having discussed about the threats and the current status of ecosystems, it's, I think, high time to look at what are we doing to protect mangroves. Well, we are doing many things to protect mangroves, and I would like to say that Sri Lanka is leading that. It's very important that despite all the setbacks, all the negativity that surrounds us, there's some important, significant milestones that have been reached by government of Sri Lanka, and I would say by us, because it's us that make always the noise, the citizens, to protect our mangroves. From one side, since 2015, we have the National Expert Committee for Mangroves in the country established under the Ministry of Environment that has been working with the government officers to see in what ways we can protect mangroves and also ensure the livelihoods linked to mangrove ecosystems. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been doing a commendable job in making sure, as the champion of mangrove conservation in Commonwealth Blue Charters since 2017, that we do share our knowledge, do things that that makes other countries turn to us to see what we are doing at the moment. And in addition to that, we've also got the National Task Force for Restoration of Mangrove Ecosystems, academia, national government institutes, as well as we have got the NGOs and non-governmental organizations that are working with us in relation to mangrove restoration task force. We also went to joint work with other countries that have similar interests with mangroves, especially along with Indonesia. In 2019, we came up with a resolution for sustainable management for global health of mangroves. This was jointly submitted by Indonesia and Sri Lanka, and it was adopted. But what is the most important thing is the national policy, which was adopted in 2020, and this policy has now enabled us to come up with mangrove action plan for the next 5 years, which is now under the discussion, almost validated, and that has now indicated the key reforms, policy reforms, and the activities that got to be done in order to protect mangroves. Out of all this, one very important thing that emerged was, once we became the champion for mangrove conservation, we had to look for ways to do this, and that required thinking out of the box. Because what has been happening is that mangrove conservation for a long time was merely going and planting something and coming out, and that didn't work. We've pumped millions, but it didn't yield anything. So then all the experts and the government agencies had to rethink in which ways we had to do. Now, one thing that came up during this time between 2019 to 2020, maybe some of you are aware and some of you are not, is the gazetted procedure for releasing mangrove lands. Now, earlier, if a developer requests a land parcel for development from a mangrove area, there was only a limited number of agencies that could get involved. Especially if it is a private land, even the government agencies had very little to do with it. But now we have a committee that has been appointed, and that committee comprises of government agencies as well as the expertise, who are expected to look at the merits and demerits before releasing a land, even before thinking about whether an EIE or IE should be done. Now, that's an important milestone that we achieved in 2019. And along with that, Department of Forest and Department of Wildlife Conservation was urged to look for land that has to be brought under protection and land that has to be restored to increase the mangrove cover in the country, to get the best benefits from mangroves. Now, as a result, I'm very happy to say that approximately 17,000 hectares of mangroves were declared under forest ordinance between this period. And that includes 70.6 hectares of conservation forests. You know, Forest Department has different conservation graded forest types. So, and then the rest as reserve forest. Okay, it goes beyond a mere declaration. Between 2019 to date, along with the officials from the Forest Department and the Wildlife Department, we've been ground truthing the existing mangrove patches and also the status of these areas that were reclaimed or taken back by the Forest Department. But most of the land that was taken back were already damaged land. Either they were containing abandoned shrimp farms or abandoned saltons. So it was not just declaration, but then also to think, okay, what are we going to do? How we are going to restore, and how we are going to make sure that the former glory is brought back as much as possible. And that is what I am going to talk about as nature-based solutions. So when it comes to nature-based solutions, we didn't actually do a lot. I must tell you, we were lazy. We didn't want to do a lot, but we wanted to learn from nature. Okay. Here's one example. This is in Mana. Now, when this land parcel was taken up, you can see the Forest Department boundary posts, but this area was totally barren, basically because of extensive grazing. Extensive grazing resulting in certain mangrove species like Avicennia marina that are so old, even 30-40 years old, Avicennia marina, found in the stunted form. Now, so someone might say that's because of the harsh conditions here. I will take you through the slides to show you a mere fence, what a mere fence did to this ecosystem when it came to restoration. And you can see here the plants that managed to grow before uh, they were the victim of cattle grazing and goat grazing. They are tall trees, but you can see the new new growth, the new plants that have come up. You can see the flowers and the fruits, but they are just stunted in the stunted form. You can see you can compare the size differences here. I'll come to this location later, and I will show you what really happened with the fencing. And that's why I said we are looking for nature-based solutions and trying to do things that are quite simple. But this also required us to think of site assessments, and also we had to do the training on restoration and scientific data management. I was showing you data that came from Vilpattu, Kalawari Basin, and I showed you what are the differences between sites. The same exercise had to be done in each and every restoration site. We had to select a restoration site looking at the quality of the nearby mangroves. We had to look at what grows there and why are they growing there, and also what is the condition of the soil, what is the condition of the water, and what are the disturbances that are there for the tidal fluctuations not to enter to the disturbed lands. And of course, the most important task was creating an army of mangrove restorers. They had to spend quite a number of years, a number of days in the field first, learning about mangroves, their biology, seed ecology, and also then looking for solutions how to come up with number one seedlings, and also next thing is to prepare the land that will accept the plants willingly and let them grow. You saw the harsh conditions earlier. We also had another important task to perform, is not to ensure that we grow mangroves in the right location. Now here you see again a picture that comes from the north. If you happen to go in the right time, you will see the mangroves and also the salt marsh. Then you know, okay, you are not supposed to touch, because this itself is a unique ecosystem and you are not supposed to go and plant in mangroves in a salt marsh. But if you happen to go in the wrong season, someone might think, oh, here is a barren land, why not we bring mangroves here? So those are the kind of discussions and the training we had to do with the officers, and in order to make them understand what to restore and what not to restore. We also had to do a few other things. Traditionally, mangrove restoration had been a fun activity. People had been going into mangrove forests, people have been participating to mangrove restoration, with really good dedication, but not knowing where to plant. Now you can see here in Putlam Lagoon, this is not something that we should not promote at all. The problem is we've gone and planted mangroves in the lagoon itself. Well, we shouldn't do that for two reasons. Number one, lagoon is the water body that brings water into mangroves. So you don't want to shrink a lagoon in order to create a mangrove ecosystem. That's number one. Number two, we have to also think what happens to the livelihood of these people when we come up with sort of replanting like this. So therefore, that was the other thing, because when we started, we found that restoration had always been towards water and planting something and coming back. And we had to get away from that idea and to think of some other ways of doing the restoration. In looking for nature-based solutions, we had some eureka moments. Here I show you Avicennia marina. We had lots of problems with Avicennia marina seedlings. But then we had eureka moments also, just mimicking the nature. What we found out was some chemical compounds, probably phenols in the seedling itself, does not allow the plant to grow, seedlings to grow. So what we actually did was accidentally, actually, the person himself, Manjula, from forest department, he put seedlings into a gunny bag, put it into the lagoon, and let the gunny bag stay there for few weeks, so that if the phenolic compounds were washed off, and then within the gunny bag itself the seedlings started coming in, and that made sure that we protected these species from crabs. For the crabs, these plants, especially for the crabs, this is like they are cashew, so they love it. So, but now we know how to protect our seedlings, as well as how to get a better set of saplings. So there are some eureka moments in this exercise too. So we also looked into what the nature had been doing. So here you can see just over here how the plants have come up. And we wanted to see why that this area had enabled the plants to survive while this area has not. And so we followed the clues of the nature in order to do that. You can see here the clues that we were looking at. So this is in Anivilundaval. You can see when we visited the site, one thing that we saw was the main reason why we have got mangroves again naturally settling in was because of this water. So with the slightest opportunity, nature tries her level best to reverse the tipping point. And then, having understood those things, that's exactly what we did. So remember, a trickle of tide seeping in and out has paved the path to natural restoration here. So what if a trickle of water can do that, what happens if we bring in the correct amount of water? Is the sort of kind of thinking we had. So that's exactly what we did. So we followed the clues of the nature after site assessments. And if you happen to, after this webinar, if you happen to go into Google Earth and go to a site called Pubudugama, you will be able to see this from as a satellite view. From the space itself, we have done some changes to the landscape in Sri Lanka in order to restore mangrove at a level of this, at a scale of this size. So here in Pubudugama, since 2019 to 2020 and 2021, this year we are doing something which I call facilitating the movement of water, facilitating the movement of tide, facilitating of resettling of sediments. So what we have done is, after studying the hydrology as well as the inclination of the area, the landscape, what we've done is actually coming up with an extensive canal system in order to bring the lagoon water. And that's the first thing we did, conditioning the system rather than going and coming up with mangroves in the lagoon itself. So here you are, another similar landscape, Anavilundavu Sanctuary. You can remember probably few months ago the problem that we had. This is the area that was selected for the restoration, and you know, overnight, one day, someone wanted to claim this little piece, saying that it is his land. But then again, fortunately, the entire country joined together to support the Department of Wildlife Conservation to ensure that this area remains as a protected area. Now, here what you are seeing is another classic example, abandoned for a long period. Even at the time of declaration, this area was abandoned in 1994. But with time, what we identified was nature itself alone was struggling and the restoration was not happening. So what the Department of Wildlife Conservation has done is something like this. This aerial view shows you how the department is now sort of creating canals for the water to come in to condition the area. And that once we are very sure that the system has stabilized, the soil salinity is in the right condition, the soil pH is in the right condition, water itself is in the right amount, when we think, when we know that the soil is willing to accept the plants and that they can settle there, we tend to go ahead and plant. And we also tend to check whether, how do we check whether the system is ready? Well, fauna gives us the clue. So many species of fauna, especially gastropods, from telescopium to many other gastropods, tend to come and settle here with time, telling us, yes, the system is ready. And that's what we have, what I'm showing you here. Here in Chilav, you can see one shrimp farm that was abandoned, but now you can see how the system is flourishing with the right combination of plants and also the right combination of water. And I'm happy to say that now the local fishermen are coming and fishing in these areas, and that's something good to see. And I've been talking about this thing, so I don't want to go into that. This is what has been the traditional method, mostly having plants elsewhere. It's really good to do things like that because you can involve the local community. It becomes an income for the local community. I always encourage that. To make sure that we have that kind of partnerships. But at the same time, what is also important is to see and to find solutions how when we think of realistic nature-based solution restoration, to get the best species that is required, the hardiest plant that can survive there without any problem. So that's the next experiment we did. Rather than having nurseries elsewhere, rather than buying plants from elsewhere, we established the nurseries in the ground itself. So Forest Department's nursery here and in this restoration site itself, I'm just showing you 2019, and here you are seeing 2020. You can see how the plants have sort of survived, and those that are dead are telling us, I'm not ready for this area. The plants that have survived are the hardiest, and when we take them out from this location and plant in the periphery, they know the soil, they know the tidal condition, and they are not at all surprised with the environmental conditions. I showed you this picture before. I told you not always we are going and constructing canals that you can see from space, but we are also doing lazy things. So lazy things, well, not very lazy, but this little trick that we played to see whether restoration can be achieved just by fencing. Here's the plants before that. You can see the grazing, and here's the plants after the fencing. And you can see the things that we thought are stunted because of the extreme climatic conditions tend to come up, flourish. And area that I showed you as gray is now like this. So these plants are now popping up, coming up and trying to show their true identity. So this is what I say, nature-based solutions for mangrove restoration. And this requires partnerships. And that partnerships are very, very important. And here in this case, I want to talk about the partnerships like the Anivulunda, if you take. So this is a partnership between the Department of Wildlife Conservation, Wambi University of Sri Lanka, and Wildlife and Nature Protection Society, who is now working with the Wildlife and Nature Protection Society that is working with Department of Wildlife Conservation, finding sponsors. I think that's really important because we'd always been taking money from the government coffers to do these things, but us going and doing these things are very important. So partnerships are important because partnerships have dual effects. They can also support the community, and that's quite important. And then from there, these are also places where we need the young generation to come in, get involved with research, and get involved with restoration and take the ownership, not just for them, but also for the community. And we also need the attention. I told you, as the champion in mangrove conservation, what you see here in this side, this is the British High Commissioner, and over here is the representatives from EU that are now trying to look at how this story can be taken to the rest of the world. So with that, I would stop now. I think my last slide is nature-based solutions are just following the clues, and restoration can be minimally invasive if we make the accurate observations. And I don't want to be nostalgic. I just don't want to create the same mangrove stand, but I just want to be a futurist. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam, for your more informative and comprehensive presentation. So now let's move into our questioning part. Right? So you can send your question using our chat box or using our Facebook page. Right? Madam, one question is that mangroves are a unique ecosystem and it covers both tropical and subtropical regions around the world. And some of the mangroves are considered as endangered or threatened one. Therefore, we should protect them. And are there any legal procedures to protect them, or what is the role of the government behind that? Could you please kindly explain that?
Yes, so we have few mechanisms for that. One is the schedules in the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, and also the moment a certain area is under the Department of Forest, it becomes a protected area. So if your mangrove stand is a protected area, depending on who has declared it, whether it is Forest Department or the Wildlife Department, we have the Forest Ordinance or the Flora and Fauna Protection Ordinance coming into being. So all the legal provisions in there are important. But in addition to that, the red listing exercise is important because the moment a species goes into red list, say for an example, I was talking about Scyphiphora hydrophyllaceae, the kalu or the black mangrove. Now, as it is in the red list, we have the provisions under the Environmental Act, and the Biodiversity Secretariat is responsible for the providing the due protection, not under they don't have a separate mandate, but then for the protection itself, but Biodiversity Secretariat is certainly facilitating these exercises. And as I told you, the recent mangrove policy that came up is a product of the Biodiversity Secretariat of Ministry of Environment, and at the same time, even at the moment, the action plan that is coming up is focusing heavily on sort of like conservation and restoration of uh, selected species and also selected locations in terms of their biodiversity.
Thank you, madam. There are some invasive plants associated with this mangrove ecosystem. Madam, what are the consequences of such kind of plants on mangroves? So, do we have some scientific evidences for that?
The interesting thing is here in Sri Lanka, when it comes to invasives, unfortunately, our attention have been paid a lot on aquatic invasives, no doubt about it, and that we have looked into the like impacts of aquatic invasives on other species. But when it comes to mangrove ecosystems, the research has been heavily focused on taxonomy. That's also on flora. not on
Right.
fauna.
Yes.
So, though invasives are found, now my personal experience with invasives in mangrove ecosystems, if I take the wet zone at the moment, I'm seeing two things happening. Um, uh, with uh, with I was talking about Mycenia. Now, Mycenia tend to grow over the mangroves, and with time the falling of the branches and sort of like gradual dying of the species is a very common thing that I've seen, especially on the Kerala trees. It's a very common thing. Then Delanea safraticosa is a killer everywhere where Dylonia subtricosa is found, especially in the Dua area. What we are seeing is the changes to the species composition. So the dominant species is now Dylonia subtricosa, and it has very successfully prevented the saplings emerging. And I think unless we look into ways of sort of like containing and controlling invasives, we will have real problems. We actually recently started working on a site in uh, down south to physically remove some of the invasive species and to restore the landscape. The data are coming up now. Very premature to say because, but what we are seeing is management of invasives in sort of like mangrove ecosystems requires more science, more data. So I invite those who are interested to get into that aspect and to provide us with the data that is direly required. We don't have a lot of data.
Yes, madam. Are there any medically important mangrove plants in Sri Lanka?
Of course, yes, plenty.
So could you please
Yes,
tell? Yeah.
when it comes to medicinal properties of mangroves, fishermen tend to use mangroves for different sort of like activities. Now, it's not just the medicinal property, but there's other things. Like for an example, I was very surprised to see in certain parts of like from Chilab to onward, people tend to collect the young, the sort of like the protective cover that you see in Rhizopora, the protective cover that is found in the shoots. They collect it and then they tend to sort of like keep it in water, and then they use this water as a pesticide. And but my I've heard this before also, and I've seen it, and it's a very important thing. And certain mangrove species are being used, their leaves and also the bark is being used in medicine. I think Professor Jayasingham from Eastern University has done some research about this area, and he has documented the medicinal properties and how it is used in ethnobotany. But again, that information in Betson is not well documented. So Rhizopora is used, and even Telaceria, which is a toxic plant, to be frank, because the latex is quite toxic. Yet I was told by some of the people that the same thing is being used by people when they have skin problems. What we consider
Uh,
is toxic is being used with other things when they have skin problems.
right. Thank you, madam. In your presentation, madam, you mentioned that there are about 21 true mangrove species in Sri Lanka. In which area of Sri Lanka can be seen highest species diversity, and what is the most abundant species in Sri Lanka?
The most abundant species in Sri Lanka varies from wet zone to intermediate to dry zone. And also it depends on the influence of fresh water. So where you have the freshwater influence with the as the frigid mangrove in most ecosystems, you will see Rhizopora as the most abundant species, Rhizopora mufronata and Rhizopora apiculata. But then, especially in the dry and also in arid zones, the most abundant species can be Avicennia marina, basically because they tend to form pure stands. In terms of species diversity, it's a tricky question because not that we have not studied the species diversity in many locations of the country. We have been actually it's very recently that we've started looking into the species diversity in mangrove ecosystems, especially in the north after the war only, that we are now getting into those areas. But I would say, as a rule, in the intermediate zone, we see a high species diversity. That's basically because you tend to have a mixture of species that seems to be there in the wet zone as well as in the dry zone.
Thank you, madam. I have one more question. So, mango restoration is actually very much essential for a blue-green future. So, what are the responsible organizations in Sri Lanka to assist them, such as IOC and wildlife? And who are the right, if somebody is planning to have such kind of restoration procedures or projects, who are the right person to contact?
Contact the Department of Forest, contact the Department of Wildlife Conservation, because at the moment, most of the lands that have been identified for restoration are with them. And also, I must commend here the good work that is done by Department of Wildlife Conservation and Department of Forest. Department of Forest took a brave step in moving forward in doing restoration, and that's very commendable. But at the same time, I must also commend the work that is done by Sri Lanka Navy. Wherever we have Sri Lanka Navy placed in our coastal zone, they have been heavily involved with mangrove restoration work. So you can contact if you want to work together with Sri Lanka Navy. And in addition to that, at the moment we have several non-governmental organizations that are into mangrove conservation activities. For an example, Wildlife and Nature Protection Society is now working with Department of Wildlife Conservation in order to go ahead with the restoration. And at the same time, we have many other, and also we have local organizations. For an example, Small Fisheries Federation, or what is known as Sulu Divara Samithya in Pambala, Sudisa. They've been sort of like involved with mangrove related work for a long time. So there's several organizations. When you want to, and I must also make this the opportunity to mention that Ministry of Environment, along with the Biodiversity Secretariat, is now coming up with guidelines and also protocols for restoration. Now, the time has come for us to streamline and to make sure that things are happening properly, not haphazardly, because the idea is also not just to restore, but also to take a stock account of how much carbon are we fixing through these endeavors.
Thank you very much, madam. One more question. Are there any specific or sensitive fauna associated with specific mangrove flora?
Yes, I was sort of like it. I would say when it comes to fauna, specific fauna are all brackish water adopted fauna that we tend to see, and they are mainly in water. So brackish water tend to have many specific fauna that I don't want to get into details, from the different types of fish to specific gastropods that are found only in mangrove ecosystems. Again, information is very scanty apart from some of the studies done on a personal interest by people like Dr. Malik Fernando, who has been studying mangrove associated gastropods for a long time. Uh, we don't have a lot of information about fauna. That's why I said at the very beginning that time has come for us to move from plant-based studies into the into understanding the whole system and also understanding the relationships between fauna and flora.
Our final question is that Rhizophora anomali. Madam, can be seen in Sri Lanka in this for
Rhizophora anomalyana.
yeah,
Yeah, that's a good
anomala,
thing.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
the thing is this: we do have one or two few Rhizophora anomalyana plants in Pambala. I
Okay.
go by
Hmm.
the sort of like the taxonomy that has been accepted for the red list.
Right.
The true identity of Rhizophora anomalyana is still a dispute. While some of us accept that Rhizophora anomalyana is found in the country, another set of botanists are not accepting it, and that's the main reason why I was talking about this 21 species. So Rhizophora anomalyana is certainly here, but then again, um, is it truly a separate species? Is still a question.
Right. Thank you very much, madam. I can see no more questions. And on behalf of the Institute of Biology, I would like to extend a very hearty vote of thanks to our guest speaker, Professor Mrs. Sewandi Jayapodi. And also, thank you everyone for taking the time to be here today. Thank you very much again. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Okay.